Without further ado, let me begin by talking about why this particular book has created such a vast body of visual arts. And just to preface the slides I'll show, I'm mostly focused, like 90% of this is going to be um, visual graphic art in the form of illustration or drawing. So two-dimensional, except for something at the very end. So I'm not even touching most of the time sculpture, fabric art. There's lots of tapestries that I don't talk about. So we're looking mostly at illustrations, paintings, etc. We'll begin with a few inscriptions, as you will see. But part of the reason why Revelation has spawned so much is because of something we call ekphrasis. So ekphrasis is a fancy word of basically language that describes in great visual detail, right? And it comes from the Greek ek, coming out of, that's a preposition. And also you can add that onto other words. And then phrasis, to speak. So speaking out, right? So speaking out a vision of what one sees. And of course, all of Revelation is preoccupied with vision. A seer, literally one who sees, is beholding a vision and describing everything he sees. And the descriptions that we get are the most vivid, I would say, that we get in the New Testament. So sure, in the Gospels, we will have vivid parables in which we have, certain visual prompters of allegories like a mustard seed growing into a great tree, or we have the Good Shepherd of John, but we don't get, a ton of preoccupation with color or detail or anything of the beautiful or luxurious like we get in the description of Revelation 21 of the New Jerusalem, or anything like this. So this is from the description of the throne room, Revelation chapter 4. And there in heaven stood a throne with one seated on the throne. And the one seated there looks like jasper and carnelian. And around the throne is a rainbow that looks like an emerald. Around the throne are 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones are 24 elders dressed in white robes with golden crowns on their heads. And coming from the throne are flashes of lightning and rumblings and peals of thunder. And in front of the throne burn 7 flaming torches, which are the 7 spirits of God. And in front of the throne, there is something like a sea of glass crystal. So here we have colors, we have gems, gold, metal, and the crowns, the description of clothing, right? Flames and lightning. So all sorts of different types of light. And some of these descriptions kind of go beyond our understanding. What does it mean, a rainbow that looks like an emerald? Not quite sure. And also these stones names, jasper and carnelian, they may not correspond with our modern understanding of what these gems and minerals are. Sometimes these labels are a guess, right? Our mineralogy may not be exactly what the ancient Greek is describing. So here we have something that could be quite bizarre, but also very visually stimulating. And that, I would say, is one of the reasons why we have so much art coming from just this one book, right? We don't have a ton of art of, the Pauline epistles. It just doesn't lend itself to that. We may have iconography of Apostle Paul, iconography of the other apostles, and certain illustrations, of course, of the crucifixion and of the parables. But Revelation lends itself really to very strong graphic imagery. This didn't begin immediately. So what we have at the oldest visual representation of Revelation really comes with a motif. Symbol that comes from that is the Alpha and the Omega, said 3 times in the book, the last time in Revelation chapter 22, in which Jesus, the Son of Man, Christ, says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end. And this saying gets picked up in symbols and a motif that gets repeated throughout carvings, inscriptions, and shows up, of course, in icons of Jesus and mosaics and other representations as time goes on. So in the Greek, you have ego ta alpha kata ho, or o hoprotos kai eskatos earche kai totelos. So that same thing, you'll see the alpha and omega, you'll see the two letters that begin those words, then they become represented in the iconography alpha and omega. Note to all of you, I didn't realize this until I think a year ago, that omega is actually omega, big O, as versus Omicron, which is micron, right? So we basically have little o and big O. Omega is just simply the big one. But here in the lowercase is that what looks like to us in English a W, right? But that's really the lowercase Greek omega. And this motif of the alpha and omega is usually flanking the key rho. And by key rho, I mean what you see in the Greek, the letter key and rho. It looks like an X and a P in English. Those are the first two letters for the Greek word Christos, which is, of course, where we have the translation into Christ. So we'll have the symbol of Christ, the key and the rho, and you'll see that in just a second, flanked by the alpha and the omega. So in something like this, as a 4th century inscription within a catacomb, that's in Rome, the Domitilla catacombs, and it becomes this underground network of graves, burial sites. There's mosaics in there, frescoes, and then also carvings like this, in which you'll see the key and the rho, put together in that form, and then on either side, the alpha and the omega. Possibly over an inscription that's commemorating somebody or inscribing a verse, possibly. So we see this in this is the earliest motif that we see coming from the book of Revelation. You'll also see it in something like this. This is also 4th century on a plaque of a sarcophagus. Here we have a wreath and a giant key rho, and within it, within the bars of the key, is the alpha and the omega. You'll see it also somewhere further away in Egypt. This is now moving into the 7th and 8th century. This is a stele in which you have a marker, like a monument of someone who has died. And I'm guessing plenes, that's the Greek inscription on the top, is the name of somebody. Iathros actually means doctor. So I wonder if that's the grave marker or monument to this person who has died, named Plenes, who's a doctor. I'm just guessing here. But you'll see above it, right, the key rho, and on either side, the alpha and omega. And especially in funerary inscriptions, right, it is a reminder of what's to come, right, of eternity. So that is, of course, a symbol of hope, the understanding of eternal life and of the Son of Man's triumphal return and who's truly ruling the kingdom, right? And so that death will eventually give way to resurrection. So that, of course, is going to be a popular inscription that you see on the sarcophagi and on funerary inscriptions in the catacombs and in this stele. Another ancient motif that comes a little bit later. So here we had Alpha and Omega, which is an alphabetical motif, right? The Lamb of God becomes a graphic visual drawing representation. That is also one of the earliest, not as early as Alpha and Omega, but an early graphic representation borrowed from Revelation. And I don't mean Agnus Dei, the Lamb of God, as we have within the Gospels only. So not just the Paschal Lamb symbol of Jesus, but with this motif comes with certain things, the Lamb on Zion in chapter 14. So then I looked and there was the lamb standing on Mount Zion. So sometimes you'll see a lamb standing on a mountain or a lamb in front of the throne of God. And this is very clearly not the imagery of the Gospels and equating Jesus with a lamb, but definitely borrowed from an apocalyptic scene from Revelation. So, for example, here we have the lamb. This is part of a beautiful cover for the Gospels from Ravenna, dating from the 5th century. And here you'll see the lamb with the halo around it, along with scenes of Jesus as he was a human, but then commemorated as the lamb that was slain in Revelation, right? The lamb that has the power that overcomes all the things that Jesus experienced in his human, earthly life. But then supreme over that, implicit in this, is the lamb. Here also we have the lamb represented in a mosaic, also in Ravenna. This is 6th century. On the very top of the ceiling, if you go in and you look straight up in the apse, you'll see the lamb with the halo and the star surrounded by the angels. So this is certainly representing that triumphant lamb in front of the throne of God, represented in chapter 14 and the breaking of the seals. So these are another early motif. Here is something even more explicitly borrowed from Revelation. This is a mosaic that we have in Basilica di Santi Cosma in Damiano in Rome. And here you'll see that scroll in front of the Lamb, and it has 7 seals that need to be broken, right? And so in chapter 5, we have one of the elders before the throne says to John of Patmos, "Do not weep, because no one is worthy to unseal the scroll. The Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals." Ironic that the Lion of the tribe of Judah is represented by paradoxically a lamb, but the lamb is what ultimately in the following verses is the one opening the seals and causing disaster to happen upon the earth as each seal is opened and the horsemen come out, etc. And so here represented, you'll often see the lamb seated in front of the throne, or here kind of on a plinth, on a cushion oftentimes, and then represented in front of it the seals that he is worthy to open. So that's a popular motif. Here's something later, a few centuries. Here we're fast forwarding to the 11th century. This is from the Apocalypse of Saint Severus. So this is an illustration, an illumination of the Apocalypse. And here we have quite literally represented, right, the many-eyed lamb with the many horns. So this strange, almost monstrous description of the lamb, very literally represented. And you'll see that now, instead of a scroll, contemporary with its own time, we have a codex-looking thing with seals that need to be broken. So codex is a book that opens like our books today as versus a scroll. And so here it looks more like a codex that can be opened, and these dangling seals. You'll see that also of like seals hanging from a book that the lamb is opening. And then here in the inscription, you have the Latin saying Agnus aperet opens sextum, 6th sigillum, the 6th seal. So the lamb is about to open the 6th seal in this particular illumination of that manuscript. Going even further, here's another many-eyed lamb, many-horned lamb. Also, again, like on a plinth, right, covered. And here we have the representation of the 4 different creatures borrowed from Ezekiel. Here we have the man, the eagle, the lion, and the bull. This is from an illumination of a manuscript within the British Library. So actually the British Library has just digitized this, and you can find it of this additional manuscript 35166. It doesn't really have any other title besides that. But here we have the lamb surrounded by the 4 creatures, which, as you may know, have come to represent the 4 evangelists, the 4 writers of the Gospels. So Matthew being represented by the man, the eagle representing the Gospel of John, the winged lion representing the Gospel of Mark, and the winged bull, the Gospel of Luke. Lots of different reasons and possibilities of why the evangelists are represented by these 4, but that's what in Christian iconography, those have come to represent and become their symbols. Here also you'll notice that Christ is bearing a banner, right? And so here we have a further more militaristic, associated with crusader symbol that's being used, right? So you'll see the lamb morphing from what we saw at the very earliest into something carrying a standard. And of course, there's the very popular Agnus Dei, Lamb of God, that's also carrying the cross, right? And you'll see that in other Christian iconography, not necessarily exactly the lamb standing on the Mount of Zion, from Revelation 14, but the 2 are quite related. And oftentimes those 2 types of depictions of the lamb are put together. So here we have both the cross standard of the banner being held by the strange, monstrous looking lamb from Revelation smushed into one, right? So you'll have an overlap of the 2 different lambs as we see normally represented from the Gospels, and then the Lamb of God from Revelation, overlapping in the way that's they're represented. So these are the two earliest motifs that we usually find of visual representation, Revelation, Alpha and Omega, and also the Lamb of God represented as triumphant above what has happened to Jesus that was slain, resurrected as this all-powerful Lamb who is worthy to open the seals. And then we move on to a different phase of visual representation, which is illumination, illustrations of all the scenes of the apocalypse. So before we have these gathered codices of the text of Revelation that become illustrated, we don't have many, or if any, representation of the cycles of disaster or catastrophe. You notice, there's symbols that make sense that have become really powerful, Alpha and Omega, especially on grave markers, and then also of the Lamb representing Christ or shown with Christ in different mosaics, and Christ triumphant in that particular symbol. But the greater, more complicated scenes of catastrophe, of cataclysm, the pouring of the bowls of wrath, the opening of the seals and what comes forward, we don't have great visual representation of that until we have these books that are illustrated copies of the apocalypse. And the Trier Apocalypse is early, in fact, I think the earliest representation, the oldest surviving illustrated one we have of that. So it is a codex containing the Latin, the Vulgate Latin of Revelation. It's written in what's called the Carolingian uncial, so lowercase Latin in the Carolingian script, in a earlier phase than later styles. Provenance of this is unknown. You can guess from where the illustrations, how they look, what it might be. It's housed in Germany, of course, in Trier, and there are 74 illustrations. So the Trier Apocalypse, I'll just show you. So this is the Latin page starting with chapter 8, verse 13. So it says, and I don't know how many of you have Latin, but I'll read it and maybe you can guess just from what I say, what it's saying. So et vidi et audivi, vocem unius aquilae volantar per medium caeli dicenter voce magna why habitantibus in terra. So why might make you think whoa. And that's exactly what's happening. Is somebody saying whoa. It's the Aquila, it's the eagle. So he sees, John the seer sees the eagle flying in the midst of the heaven, and he hears and sees it say woe to the inhabitants of the earth with a great voice. So that's the beginning of the scene, the page that I've borrowed to show you the Carolingian script of this particular Trier manuscript. Here we have a depiction then of Christ and the seven lampstands, and has a sword coming out of its mouth. This is when he first appears to speak to John of Patmos, right? And he's going to send a message to the churches on the earth. And so we see represented also the landscape of where John may be and where Asia Minor, perhaps the coastline of where the churches are going to receive this message. We also have here the 7 different churches represented, and John is busy writing the message that the Son of Man is giving him to give to the 7 different churches. Here we have now Christ seated on the throne, surrounded by the 4 different creatures. Then we have the torches, and in front, and this becomes also visually represented in lots of different ways with great imagination, the sea of glass or the crystal sea in front of the throne of God. So you see here now greater tackling of the quite bizarre language that I read to you at the very beginning of the session, right? Of the throne looking like a rainbow that looks like an emerald, or the glassy sea. What exactly is that? And these strange creatures, right? Now depicted with greater and greater detail as artists are interpreting them, sometimes quite literally, sometimes in a symbolic imagery, depicting them in this way. So that's the Trier apocalypse. Then we have the Bamberg apocalypse, and you've seen me draw some of these illuminations from this apocalypse before. So this is dating from the 11th century, and it includes both the Book of Revelation and then a gospel lectionary. So readings from the Gospels according for liturgy. It's called an Ottonian manuscript coming after Carolingian, so under Otto dynasty, created, we know, actually in a scriptorium in Reichenau. So we have mostly monks working who are experts at copying and also illuminating together in a scriptorium over a period of possibly 20 so years, in which we have 74 illustrations illustrating the apocalypse. So to give you an idea of that, here we have the Son of Man on the throne, and you'll see what looks like a codex with 7 seals. And then those who have come and approaching, the elders are coming, approaching, and throwing their crowns down. It looks like almost like they've detached their halos right from their heads and are throwing them down before the throne of Christ. And then you have John of Patmos looking up and beholding this vision, right? So here we have both the scene of the angel describing or explaining and John seeing, and then above what he is seeing of the throne. So you have the torches and or the bulls, the flaming bulls, and the elders throwing their crowns before the seat of Christ. Here's another, and this should be apparent to you after everything that I've been saying in the last couple of sessions, but this is depicted the great whore of Babylon, right? So she is seated on a beast of 7 heads, and she's holding a cup of abominations. She's dressed in purple and scarlet, sumptuously dressed, right? And here again, we have John of Patmos above this time, looking down. So it's interesting if you see the juxtaposition with what I just showed you, where he was looking up to the throne of God. Here, separated by this banner of text, John is now looking down with the angel pointing at the whore of Babylon and the beast upon which she rides. So this is quite a different tone that's being struck here, and also the direction of the visual and how that's being perceived by John of Patmos. And here's an interesting one also. It is the depiction of the Last Judgment. So we have trumpets sounding, we have Christ seated as the judge. And this you'll see in later and later Renaissance. And of course, it might call to mind that the great Last Judgment of Michelangelo, in which you have Christ at the very center and all the saints and angels, right? And those being judged descending below. And that becomes a motif in much later art in the centuries to come of the Last Judgment. Here we have represented the scrolls, and this is that strange passage in which it's quite a heavenly bureaucracy in which they open the Lamb's Book of Life, and also other books are opened in which they need to consult of what everyone has done, right? What each individual has done, and then there's all the mass of everyone who has ever died or lived standing, and you also have those who are dead. This looks like a scene from Michael Jackson's Thriller, where everybody's coming up out of the ground, and they're slightly pale
Who was
green.
in there?
And so they're coming up, and those who are not worthy are being thrown, and you see on the further lower right-hand side in chains, and what looks like a black pit. So this is the judgment of the dead, the Last Judgment. And you'll see this structure, right? This kind of framework for this particular scene repeated over and over again through Renaissance paintings and later of this particular scene. So next we come to a series of different manuscripts in which we have Beatus of Leobenau writing a commentary on the apocalypse. And from that, we have written in the 8th century, and we have different copies of this commentary that are illuminated, that are drawn with beautiful drawings in each one, but there are 29 surviving. So when you hear of the commentary of Beatus or the Beatus Apocalypse, right, that's referring to the text. It's a commentary on the Book of Revelation. But each of these books is separately illuminated, and they're coming from different centuries as well. So it's a really interesting look at how art changes to show the same scene in different settings. So we have everything from the 9th to the 13th century, generally in the Iberian Peninsula, but you'll see different styles represented by different copies of this particular a commentary. So for example, this is the style that you'll find in the Facundus Beatus, and you have here the scene of the beast conferring power to the beast, to the other beast, right? And all the worshipers bowing below. And you'll see the knot of the dragon and then the horns and the heads of the beast with hooves like a cow's or of a horse's, and those bowing. And then this very brilliant coloration of the stripes within and also of the robe. So you remember looking at the Trier apocalypse, right? That seemed compared to the brilliant colors quite different. Like that was much more uh, line driven, right? In which we have a sketch, but here is very graphically brilliant, even more so, I would say, than the Bamberg apocalypse, and with lots of detail, like the speckles upon the beast, the lines and the wrinkles shown on the robes, and then the dots upon the beast on the right, with the yellow horns and the red eyes. So here is from the Facundus Beatus, the Morgan Beatus here. This is the throne room scene. And here, really interesting, like look at the crystal sea, right? The glassy sea is now represented in what looks like either a fountain, crystalline formations. I'm not sure how you might want to interpret that, but we also have the lamb again. Instead of a son of man, here we have the lamb, right? As is in literally within that passage. The music being played, because remember there's hymnody accompanying that particular scene. And then you have the elders also seated and the four different creatures at the very top. Holding their different books, so also implying the evangelists that they eventually become, right? And then also the pattern of the foliage surrounding it, framing it, the beautiful little flowers that are also separating this, and then the bands of color again in the Morgan Beatus. Here's something quite different. This is the Ozma Beatus. And here you see the shift, right? This is quite a different style. So compare, right? This style, the way the eyes look, the way the beasts look, especially look at the beast on the right, right? The beast from the land. And it's the way it's shaped, and then compare that, right? Also with the lamb here, with the horses, the much more flowing lines. It looks more dynamic in the ways that it's moving. Here we have Christ seated on a horse and the sword again coming out of his mouth. But here we have something that perhaps is just on the edge of a different era of drawing, right? So coming later, perhaps on the cusp of more Romanesque drawings that we see more in the medieval period, the way the faces are shown, the way the horse's body, right? The curvature of that is changing. So all of this is what makes the Beatus Apocalypse commentary so interesting, is to see the shift in the different geographic locations, and also in the ways that it changes through the centuries of how that looks. Then we have something completely different, right? So far we've been looking at these individual illuminations in which you have oftentimes, right, we have monks, scribes working in a scriptorium or monastery in which they are copying something with great care and illuminating each thing individually or collaboratively, but each picture, right, is a part of a precious, unique copy that has to be copied and redrawn in order for it to be circulated, or if it's going to be passed on. It's a book of great value because it is so much labor is put into each of these, right? When we get to here, we have in the end of the 15th century, we have Albrecht Dürer, who is in Germany, and he's creating woodcuts. So, right, we have had, and I didn't pull slides here for fear that we would run out of time. We have wood block carvings that illustrate the apocalypse before this. And you would see these blocky cuts that would show quite simplistically the scenes of the apocalypse. So this is a development in technology to represent something that can be reproducible at a much higher rate, right? Rather than having each illustration, each illumination created completely afresh for each codex. Now we have the ability to carve something into a woodblock and then stamp it, right? Much as we have the printing press coming also for text. So with the development of woodblock and woodcut illustrations, that begins to proliferate. But what we have before Durer is blocky lines, more simplistic, not quite a lot of emphasis on shading unless it's, striated lines across the woodblock. And then we get to Durer. You probably may already be familiar with it, but Durer, of course, is one of the greatest illustrators of the apocalypse and has become so influential in the art that comes after and has become iconic in particular scenes that come from these 15 plates of the woodcuts. So, for example, this is the Son of Man, and speaking to John of Patmos, here we have the candlesticks and the clouds and the sword coming from the mouth of the Son of Man, and John of Patmos receiving this message. And the level of detail and the level of translation from the text into something that's quite literal, but also still very bizarre. So interesting to say that one of his friends was actually Erasmus, who is also part of that great era of humanists. Erasmus, who also created the earliest Greek edition of the New Testament, who said that Durer is somehow able to make what's not imaginable into his art, right? And so here we see a representation of that, something so incredibly bizarre, but created with so much detail in the shading, in the little details of the different types of lampstands that are being shown and what's at the base of each of them, the stylized pillar of each of them. The face of the Son of Man also seems to capture something completely otherworldly. And also the shading in all of this, the detail that goes into that. This is one, of course, iconic image. Here is perhaps one of the best well-known ones in which we have the four riders, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, in which they are let loose, the seal is broken, and they are let loose upon the earth. And look at the dynamism of the action, right? It looks the charging of the horses, the motion coming down, and the level of detail for each of the riders, what they're confronting and trotting over, what they're carrying, each one of them, right? So we have the scales, the sword, an archer, the angel above, presenting this in this vision, death, Hades, disease, war, right, riding into the earth. And the entire motion, right, even though we know this is a static woodblock cut, right, but the motion is so dynamic within this that you can feel, right, the motion, the dynamism of this particular scene brought to life. So with that, I'm going to move then to a progression of images that look at important themes, other images that have been significant for different visual interpretation through the centuries. So far what we've looked at is the motif, Alpha and Omega. We've looked at the Lamb on Zion, and then we've looked at the progression into illustrations for commentary, for the text of Revelation. And here what's interesting about Durer's is that the focus is no longer so much on the text. So this is presented, as you've seen, the apocalypse is in figuris. So it is the apocalypse in figures, right, with illustration, as if that is the main focus. It is the main focus. The 15 plates of the woodcut is the primary focus of that edition, not necessarily the text, right? And so here the visuals are, I would say, pulling away from the text, in which, remember, with the Trier Apocalypse, that is the Vulgate, which then is illustrated, or the Beatus is a commentary, which is also illustrated to accompany that. With Dürer, we have the image leading the way. The image then becomes the focus and not necessarily the accompanying text, in which we have quotations or we have portions of Revelation accompanying. It is now the accompaniment to that. And so we see in what I'm going to present now is the image then not necessarily accompanied with any text at all, but has become part of iconography that is through the ages important. So the woman clothed with the sun is especially important person from Revelation, represented in many different ways. So we have, first of all, again, from the Bamberg Apocalypse, right? We have this particular scene. So the dragon, this is in Revelation chapter 12. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. So here we have juxtaposed, and this is repeated in further scenes, but also very important, you'll see her iconography of being clothed with the sun, with the stars behind her, and the moon at her feet. And remember that, as that will be repeated again and again from the text. The child here seems already born, right? So here already figured as this small human standing next to her, and the beast awaiting from the Bamberg Apocalypse. This now, fast forward many centuries, right? This is coming from a post-Renaissance style, borrowing so much from what we know of Italian Renaissance painting. So this is the woman clothed in the sun, flees the persecution of the dragon. So you see the beast lurking on the bottom amidst the turmoil in the dark, and then movement to the light as her child is being taken. Her child was snatched up to God, right? So rescued immediately, taken out of her hands and up to God and to his throne. And you'll see again, behind her is the aura of the sun. Across her head is the halo of stars, and below amidst the cloud is the moon at her feet. So this is quite a different representation, but the same story being told now with borrowing from the kind of textures, features, and representation of angels, et cetera, that we usually associate with Renaissance paintings. Of course, this is another famous one, another figure that becomes a quite major artist for the apocalypse, which is William Blake. You may see this within popular representation of the apocalypse. If you just Google anything like Whore of Babylon painting, the things you'll come up with mostly will be the commentaries of Beatus, Dürer, and William Blake. Those are the ones that are usually showing up the most in representation. And here again, this is the woman. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. And here we have, again, the juxtaposition of light and dark in this moment of conflict in the book of Revelation. And of course, William Blake has been picked up in popular culture today. I don't know if you know, but his dragon and his painting of this dragon and with his back to us has become associated with other figures of horror that lend itself really well with this dreamlike nightmare illustration of this particular scene. Moving forward in time, here's Redon, who's in a very different manner, right? Not quite so literal, showing the woman clothed in the sun. She is about to give birth, it seems, maybe one way of interpreting that. But really the focus is on light and dark, and not necessarily the literal representation of all the different details of that particular passage. But in this sketch, right, capturing a particular moment, anticipation, waiting, and then the play of light across her face and her figure, and part of it in darkness. Here, a woman painter, finally, illustrator in 1904, a woman clothed with the sun. And here we see quite differently represented the reflection, it seems, in the water of the moon at her feet. And the glow of the sun actually seems to come from within her or amongst her robes. So quite literally a beautiful interpretation of what being literally clothed with the sun might be like, and the stars as part of crowning her hair in this representation. And this is one of my favorites. This is actually sculptural, and this is at the Our Lady of Angels Cathedral in Los Angeles. But this is a 3D representation of that particular uh, person, in which you have, if you think about the way uh, it's working as the day passes, right? She is standing on this platform with a aperture, an opening behind her head, so that during the day, she is literally clothed with the sun shining down through that aperture through her whole person. But then, and at her feet is the moon in the arch, right? And in the shadow and play of light, because of the way it's built, right? On what she's standing. So the light will look like the crescent moon. And when night comes, then she'll have the stars behind her head, right? So quite a beautiful use of nature and the sky to represent this. And there's just tons of beautiful sculptural artwork as part of that cathedral, also the doors of the cathedral in brass, and this representation. And she, in a hands forward, perhaps of supplication or otherwise, with her face, the artist has said, you know, they wanted to show something that was a mixture of where you could not identify necessarily ethnicity, identity, all of those markers, so that she then can become a universal figure in that way, borrowing from different. So her clothing is ambiguous of where she is from, so can be identified and relatable to anyone. And then the play of nature around her to represent this woman. Here is another representation from Los Angeles, but understanding the woman clothed in the sun as embodied by the Virgen Guadalupe. So part of a long history of that particular iconographic interpretation of that woman becoming symbolized in the Virgin of Guadalupe from Spain into what was called the New World, right? Into Mexico and indigenous understanding of that figure. And then interpreted in Los Angeles as part of, right, Angelenos culture, Latine culture in California and Mexico, and part of activist culture as well. So here is a mural from Boyle Heights in Los Angeles as well. So you'll see, right, the many myriad ways in which this person can be interpreted. From just those verses in Revelation chapter 12, having these afterlives, right, in so many different ways. Here, this is AI slop, right? Just to show you a different representation. I found this, actually, someone went and tried to create this with AI of what, you know, can be created without human hands. I personally hope that this is not where we're headed in the afterlife of this particular figure. Compare this with the beautiful things that we have just seen. Yeah, so this is from Night Cafe Creator 2023. I want to end with something quite different in just the last few minutes, and that I'll be speaking and then we can discuss together. But this is something totally different also, created by a man named James Hampton, called Throne of the Third Heaven of the Nation's Millennium General Assembly. He created this from, we guess, the 1950 to 64 in DC. He's from, I want to say South Carolina or North Carolina. I can't remember which, but I'll check later. But this is now housed in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So James Hampton is a Black man living in DC at the time, and he created this throne room towards the end of his life. And he had rented a storage room in a warehouse and created a fantastic representation of the throne room, borrowing images from Revelation over the years, creating this. And almost nobody knew until he had died. And the person from whom he had rented this room discovered this. And eventually, the people who then saw it understood that this needed to be preserved. It's been kept, and it's been now donated to the Smithsonian and kept in DC. But this is what it looks like in the Smithsonian now. this fantastic throne surrounded by what looks like other thrones or figures, sculptures. That had been kept secret by him for his own purposes, his own drive to create this. Here's a close-up of it, but he created this from bits of furniture, other material objects that he then covered with gold and silver foil. And then also there you'll see inscriptions. That's the tablet of the Ten Commandments. So he'll have verses and words and phrases and labels from the Old Testament on one side and the New Testament on the other. In the middle, you'll see the biggest throne at the top of which says "Fear not," is at the very top. So these inscriptions that he's added to this. So just to also another way of thinking about the throne room. Last week, we talked about empire and Revelation, how the throne room can be a mimicking of or recycling of imperial power and oppression. Here, I think, is a nice counterpoint to that, possibly, of something that was made in secret, in private, not necessarily intended for display, but for this man who is creating this in DC. We don't know his intentions or purposes. This was a Black man during the civil rights era, 1960s, creating this. But something seems quite personal and inspired in a way that there's also an inscription that he wrote on the board in which, if the vision dies, the people will not survive, right? There's something about the necessity of vision that I think creates a note of hope. And also this outpouring of artistic dedication and craft in a way that has not been recognized, but now is part of the Smithsonian display.